It's a very curious time in this part of the season of The War Within, because as we go along, going for our recap of the meta of Mythic Plus, a lot of things have been going down in the past couple of weeks. We have gotten the release of 11.0.5, wondering if it might have brought some changes because of some of the balance tuning given to the specs, and then shortly after, literally just a few days after, Blizzard hit us with a balance tuning hotfix coming in just a couple of days with this upcoming reset, possibly even larger than the amount of changes that came last week with the release of this patch. So we are now in the awkward position where we are now trying to look at the situation in the meta of Mythic Plus, the performance, for example, of the specs this week in Mythic Plus, to try to see how things are changing, what specs, for example, started doing better and which specs have started doing worse compared to before the patch, to see what the patch brought, and then we have to go back to what is about to change in just a couple of days. Several different changes, like the buffs given to Balanced Druid, the multiple nerfs that will gonna come the way of Hunters. You have some decent buffs to Mischievous Monk, but what will take the spotlight definitely are going to be the mega nerfs going the way especially of Elemental, as well as the good buffs going for Warlocks and for Warriors. So when we go at the current situation based on what players saw this week, well, first of all, for now we are seeing much lower keys on average, the key level on average being completed this week compared to last week. We are barely even getting into the 12 range this week for now. What are the two most visible changes in here from last week to this week are the far higher attempts at playing Protection Paladin compared to the previous weeks, as well as the far higher attempts at playing Elemental Shaman this week compared to previous weeks. Now, unfortunately, we have to discard one of these two, which is Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman has received its rework, which, yes, let's not try to pretend it was balanced and it was nicely tuned. It was a little bit overboard in Mythic Plus, the amount of damage Elemental Shaman was able to do. This is still unupdated. This is the old version that didn't even bother to pick Ascendance or DRE. The current version, though, of Elemental Shaman has completely abandoned the fire side of Elemental to go full down Ascendance, DRE, as well as Maelstrom generation, and more importantly, Finisher, Spender, damage, and using Spenders to spend as much Maelstrom as you can to generate as much Tempest procs as you can. Ascendance has turned into a massively powerful burst cooldown. Of course, Blizzard somehow in just 3 days were immediately able to recognize this was OP and nerfed it. Unfortunately, as we pointed out already in our last video, this nerf was far too big. So Elemental Shaman is, at the very least for now, poised to be nuked from orbit, from their possible power that we have seen this week. It's not that the week before this, it's not that Elemental Shaman was weak. This was week 4. This was pre-nerf, unbuffed Elemental, right? So then you have week 5, still powerful, still one of the highest results in Mythic Plus, and then it was post-buff, which became the strongest. Now, with the nerfs, these are at least a 20+% nerf, slightly less in Mythic Plus, to be fair, like 15-ish%. It's a bigger one in single target, which is what will make them much weaker in the raid. We have pointed this out already. So the first one we have to discard is the just massively increased performance as well as popularity this week for Elemental Shaman. Now, the one that might hold slightly more value is Protection Paladin, because unlike Elemental Shaman, it's not that Blizzard went, oh god, we overbuffed Protection Paladin, we have to nerf them, right? There is nothing for Protection Paladin. Protection Paladin is not being nerfed in the next couple of days with the next reset. So what you see now, for example, in just this week, is that the absolute dominance of Protection Warrior towards the high keys has, not really been there again this week. Obviously, they're still on the high end of results. They're still present, and also if you look not at the, only the top like 30, 40 results or whatever, but you look at the just high keys in general, 13 and up, Protection Warrior is still the choice. Even if you keep going higher, really, 14 and up, Protection Warrior is still ahead. However, this is definitely an improvement compared to what we had even just last week. So, the first meaningful and visible change is the fact that now Protection Paladin is now the one to contend with Protection Warrior. Of course, if Protection Paladin gains a lot of playtime, they gained, 23%, right? But Protection Warrior only lost 17, some other spec must have lost popularity, some other spec must have gotten lower. And the answer is Guardian Druid. The one that has been losing out effectively is Guardian, because Guardian, before this, the split wasn't between Prot and Prot. The split was between Warrior and Guardian. So, with the buff of Protection Paladin, the one who seemed to have lost more actually isn't even Prot Warrior, it's Guardian Druid when it comes to tanks. Now, the other growth we have seen, even going back to the top keys, is this white thing right here. Again, overall, just like we said for tanks, overall, the idea of Resto Shaman being the healer is still here. This is all keys, and then, this is 12 and up. Absolute dominance. Even if you go 13 and up, discipline goes from 11 to 13, and then 14 and up from 13 to 18, and then 15 and up from 18 to 24. So it is going higher. It is improving towards the top end keys, but of course Resto Shaman is still the default choice. Now, what is also interesting is that while Discipline Priest is now actually the second most played healer in the high level keys, in this upcoming patch in, 24 hours in NA, Discipline is getting buffed. Their Radiance, their flat healing from Radiance is buffed by 20%. Their spot healing, their basically non-atonement single target heal, is also being buffed. And then this is irrelevant because Discipline doesn't play with Oracle, but it is still good that they get an extra buff, also considering the power they have right now. To be fair, part of this might have been because of the composition that the group was running. In this case, it was a Shaman DPS. This would only be a thing when you're running a Shaman DPS. You don't have a Shaman healer, so you don't really need to run double Shaman. We have pointed this out multiple times, no Shaman healer, Shaman DPS, there is a Shaman healer, there is no Shaman DPS. You don't run double of the same class in a comp. Sometimes it still happens, right? Sometimes there are going to be some groups that will do this, but in general, it won't happen. So the prominence of Priest is also somewhat tied to a Shaman being a DPS in your comp. And what's happening this week is that the Shaman DPS are being nerfed. So that might actually also go and impact the play rate or the power in general of Discipline as well, because Enhancement is getting a flat out nerf to a bunch of their abilities. Elemental Shaman is getting an even bigger nerf, so Elemental is completely out of the picture. Enhancement is still getting nerfed, so even with this growth this week for Discipline, it might not continue rising in the next weeks. It might not be a case that we have seen in the past post buff of a certain spec mid-season, for example this, the classic Exodia comp, right? Or even something in previous seasons like the patch before season 2 when Resto Shaman was buffed, right? It kept growing. This might not be the same case for Discipline this season due to the possible damage that the nerfs to the DPS Shamans will do to Discipline Priest. Now, one of the things that is observable even to the naked eye, that was already observable as we were checking the very top keys, like for example Mage, in this case here being Frost, right? And then there is an Arcane Mage, back to Frost Mage. We have to scroll back to other pages to try to find any more mages than the same two. Mr. Milk Mage and Mr. Semage are the only two ones available, but even beyond them, there was starting to be more of a split between Frost and Arcane. And then as time went on, there were more and more Frost Mages. Now, this week we have at 15 and up, so we're talking about the very, very, very highest keys. Frost Mage is now comfortably ahead. If you go back to 14, you still have Frost Mage ahead. If you go down to 13, you have now Arcane slightly ahead of Frost. So the 13 to 14 gap is when Frost Mages start being played more. And this in general has also been visible by the play rate from Arcane over here. Arcane starts out at 12, which is actually was the second highest, the second most present in the high key range. Back then it was 11 keys. and it was Arcane. And then it went down to 8, and then 9, and then 7, and then 5. So they have cut their popularity by more than half of what they had at the beginning of the season compared to where they are now. So there has been a visible drop. And it's not that since the beginning of the season, week 1, Arcane was some top performer. We have pointed this out every one of our recaps. You know, Arcane was never really in the top like 5, top 6, top 8, and they even fell out of the top, top 10, or they weren't even in the top 10 to begin with since week 1. And as we kept going, week 2, week 3, week 4, Arcane just kept chilling in a not really that exciting position in terms of overall damage in keys. So even after the changes of the patch that were supposed to mega buff them, and then the hotfix which reversed the mega buffs back to where they were before, and even after the fact that right now, at this moment, your average Arcane Mage is playing Spellslinger. That's the major change from before the patch to after the patch, the switch from Sun Fury to Spellslinger. Even changing your hero talent hasn't really improved your performance that much, and now you're losing more and more as you go higher in keys over Frost Mages. Now, one thing that might be slightly positive, although we have already seen not being that relevant in the very highest of keys, is Augmentation. They're not going quite the route of Arcane, right? Going from 12 to 5, but they have gone from 11, 12, 14, and then 13, 10, 8. So they peaked in the first few weeks, and then they have started a decline over time. As mentioned, this is not representative of what likely the MDI teams or title pushing teams might be doing right now, because what they are doing right now is running an Augmentation Evoker in practically every one of their keys. So, that's Augmentation Evoker still. Not for the general population of average high keys, which in the past few weeks have been 12 to 13s, basically. At this range, Augmentation has been losing out a bit more. Now, we might be wondering a little bit what might change with the patch coming for the other specs, because we mentioned the changes to Shaman, we mentioned the changes to Priest, as well as the ones that Mage already received, but we also have positive changes going the way of Balanced Druid. We also have not that positive changes going the way of Hunters, and then flat out buffs across the board for all of the Warlocks and all of the Warriors, DPS Warriors. So when we go back to how those specs are doing right now, well, Warlocks are popular overall as a spec, as a class, as usual, but as soon as you start going in the high-ish level of keys, 12 plus, they are not nearly as popular. They are below Elemental, below Mages, below Druids, and below Evokers. So they are practically only above Hunters and Priests. That's it. When it comes to the melee DPS, so we're talking about Warriors now, again, all key level, Warrior is at, 15%, which is the third most popular, after Ret and after the DKs. But as you start going into 12 plus, they start losing not just to DK and to Frost, but also to Enhancement and also to Assassination. Not only that, but the second spec of DK, the second spec of DK is still more popular than both of the Warrior specs combined when we are talking about high keys. So they are being buffed, just like the Warlocks are being buffed. Now the question is this going to be that relevant compared to where they are now in terms of power in keys, in terms of performance in keys? Well, the results have been speaking for themselves for quite a few weeks. It's been quite a while since we have been checking this, and week after week, neither of the two classes, Warlock and Warrior, were doing particularly well in the overall results, even just looking at DPS numbers and not the meta, just how much damage they were doing. They were doing poorly. So now, at least with this buff, you could see multiples of them, especially Fury in Mythic Plus, and also Demo or even Destro, getting perhaps closer to here. So having more of a respectable kind of AoE damage. Now, whether or not this will be enough to actually make them more considered in Mythic Plus is a different question. The different question is likely still going to be a no. Warrior doesn't bring anything particularly exciting to a Mythic Plus key. They don't have a Bloodlust, they don't have a Combat Rest, their CC is not amazing, they don't bring any extra dispels or off-healing, for example, than other specs might be bringing. The question might be a bit more positive for Warlock, because they do have a Combat Rest, they do have Hellstones, but their CC CC, much like their interrupt, is not really amazing. They do bring a pretty good amount of tankiness and self-sufficient healing, to be fair, but, you know, the amount of buffs being given are not looking to be nearly as powerful to make them any more considered. Perhaps they might be cursing at the moment how popular the DK specs are, because they might have taken the spot of being the combat rest spec needed in your comp, but not really looking like a case for this season, considering how good Death Knights are right now. So unfortunately, we have to say that despite the buffs going the way of Arms, and then Fury, and then Demo, and then Destro and Affli, they will likely go from, you know, down here to like perhaps top of the B tier. Maybe the best of them might sneak into here, but not really anywhere near contention for becoming a new meta spec in Mythic Plus. Definitely not bad though, after the buffs they will be receiving. It should not really be a deal breaker if you're doing, for example, you know, 9, 10, 11, 12, even 13 keys in this range of keys. It should still be just fine to play with any of these specs of those two classes. The last of the specs that might deserve some attention is not at the bottom of the alphabet with Warlocks and Warriors, but at the beginning with Balance. So Balance is getting buffed. This buff is not that huge, it wasn't even a 5% buff. However, unlike their performance in the raid, which has been poor to say the least, let's switch over to the raid for a second. When it comes to throughput, Balance is actually amongst the worst of the results in the raid right now. But in Mythic Plus, Balance Druid is not nearly as bad. In Mythic Plus, their average score, meaning, you know, the average level of key, top key they are completing, is quite high. You know, it's not low at all. And then when you look at even the DPS results, Balance Druid is, ironically speaking, this week at least, the strongest range DPS performer after the very overtuned Elemental. And even in the week prior, you know, even in week 3, Balance Druid was here. In week 4, Balance Druid was here. In week 5, Balance Druid was here. And now Balance Druid is still here. So practically for the past month, for the past 4 weeks of Mythic Plus, they have been the highest range DPS overall damage performer in Mythic Plus, only below Elemental. And they are being buffed. You know, even, you know, good AoE buffs, like for example, Starfire being buffed by 5%, Starfall being buffed by 6%, more damage to shooting stars. Yeah, sure, there are also some compensation nerfs in there, but overall, this is a positive buff, and they were doing well already. Even in terms of popularity, 12 and up, Balance Druid was doing okay. You even had the occasional Balance Druid sneaking in one of the comps for high keys, even 2 of them with Gingy, even 3 of them Balance Druids in high keys showing up, actually even 4 of them, and even 5 of them, right? So it wasn't a bad spec by any means, or even a non-meta spec by any means, and it's getting buffed. So in terms of meta, Balance Druid is likely to perhaps grow a couple more percentage points. So it's a positive result for Balance Druid. It was already a near level meta spec, so this buff will only make it slightly better. That's why perhaps their buff is more relevant, even though their buff is actually a smaller buff that will go the way of the 3 Warlock specs, and even a smaller buff than the way of the 2 Warrior specs. In their case, it's more relevant because they were already doing well to begin with when it comes to Mythic Plus. We will see, of course, once the patch goes live, how much of this will change in terms of performance, in terms of results, in terms of how much the specs will change their meta state after the tuning. The buffs come in the way of the Warlocks and the Warriors, as well as the buffs for Balance Druid, as well as the nerfs to the 2 ranged Hunters, the nerf to Elemental and Enhancement Shaman, and even the rare case, you know, the rare possibility that the buff to Discipline Priest will bring them even higher and closer to Restoration Shaman. But for today, on this Monday, this was our recap for this week of Mythic Plus, the first week of 11.0.5, and now getting close to the upcoming set of new balance tuning changes after the first week of the new patch. So, with this out of the way on this Monday, it is now time to leave each other. We're now starting the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as for being able to support completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing completely for free. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, you know what? I'm fine with the rain stopping after 5 days, but why going straight back to sun? Couldn't we just stay with some clouds here and there?